Okay, let's dive right into this explainer and completely reframe how we think about burnout. I mean, we usually treat it like a sign that we just need a long weekend or maybe a vacation, right? But what if we looked at our consciousness through the lens of physics? What if your burnout isn't actually a lack of sleep, but a severe structural failure within your own psychic architecture? We really have to ask ourselves a very grounded question here. Why does trying to stand perfectly still in life always create this creeping feeling of inner dread? You know the feeling. You finally get a weekend with absolutely nothing to do, and instead of relief, you just feel this shaky, vibrating anxiety. Well, this points us to a profound mechanical reality. Rigidity is actually fragility. When you try to achieve static peace, you are essentially freezing your system. And from an evolutionary and physical standpoint, stasis is death. This brilliantly illustrates the core physical difference between two completely different modes of operating. Think of a rigid beam. It relies on being totally motionless. It seems strong, sure, but it's fundamentally fragile because it will snap under a single unexpected point of shear stress. Now, contrast that with a spinning disk, like a gyroscope. It doesn't rely on being bolted down. It relies on continuous, subtle motion to maintain perfect dynamic balance. For the spinning disk, motion itself becomes the stability. Every wobble or tilt isn't a collapse, it's simply a signal for a necessary correction. So let's get into the anatomy of the 3P=S model. To understand the heavy weight that's actually bearing down on our internal structure and causing us to snap like that rigid beam, we have to look at this framework. We're constantly managing three distinct structural loads. First, we have P1, the personal pressure. This is your interpersonal web, the social etiquette, and the face you present to your friends and family. Second is P2, the professional pressure. These are your external metrics, your status, your technical competence out in the world. But then, there is P3. This is the private domain, the shadow. It's the unrendered baseline, the private dread, and the deeply suppressed truths we keep locked away, simply because they don't fit neatly into P1 or P2. When we fail to manage these forces, and particularly when we ignore that incredibly heavy third pressure, our system fails. When the sum of these three pressures completely overwhelms our capacity, we collapse into what the framework calls the diminished self. This is a reactive, powerless state defined by toxic shame and profound psychological fragmentation. You are literally no longer driving the machine. The external pressures are driving you, leaving you in a state of constant, fragmented reactivity. Moving right along to shear stress and system collapse. Let's look at the actual crisis point and see what exactly happens inside the psychic machinery when we refuse to integrate that heavy private shadow. When you rigidly brace your professional and personal personas against your hidden private shadow, you create an absolute architectural nightmare. The resulting psychic infighting generates an unbearable shear stress. You're trying so hard to maintain the illusion of static peace, but beneath the surface, the dam is cracking. And eventually, just like that rigid dam, the system undergoes a catastrophic failure. Make no mistake, this isn't just exhaustion. This is the structural collapse of your internal operating system. This internal conflict over our suppressed, quote-unquote, not nice truths, our rage, our shame, our primal instincts, creates what Carl Jung might call the heaviest wound. But mechanically speaking, this wound is exactly the pressure point where profound transformation must begin. It is literally the densest energy in your entire system, and you absolutely cannot afford to leave it unmanaged. Which brings us to the transmutation into dynamic spin. To fix this collapsing system, we have to pivot from static mechanics over to rotational physics, using what researchers call the 0/1 engine. Think of reality as a continuous thermodynamic loop. State 0 is pure, unmanifested potential. It's chaotic, nonverbal source code. State 1, on the other hand, is manifested reality, your current, structured, localized life. The engine only runs if you constantly pull from the chaos, build a structure, and then consciously shed that structure to start all over again. If you get stuck in state 1, desperately trying to hold on to your localized render, you freeze. You completely stagnate. The philosopher Alan Watts brilliantly noted this ephemeral reality during his final summer in California. He was actually blowing smoke through a child's bubble maker, and he said, "Life is like a bubble. Poof, and it's gone." We have to recognize the temporary nature of our rendered forms. We must be willing to let our rigid structures pop, actively shedding the perishable rags of our ego to keep the energy flowing. And this principle wasn't just theoretical for Watts, it was structural. In spaces like his circular, yurt-shaped library at Druid Heights, Watts actively worked to break down linearity. He taught that intellectual boxes and rigid social conventions are the foundation of illusion. They keep our energy frozen in state one. To get the system spinning, you actually have to dissolve the box. We actually see this exact mechanical principle playing out in history through a radical group known as the Holy Fools, or the Rigidity in Russia. Monks like Simeon of Emesa or John the Iron Cap. They didn't just meditate quietly. They aggressively shattered social conventions. They feigned madness, wore literal chains, and publicly mocked the rigid norms of their societies. Now, I'm certainly not suggesting you wear an iron cap to your next corporate staff meeting, but their extreme behavior was a deliberate technology. They used it to dissolve the frozen render of societal expectation. By breaking the rigid beam of culture, they tapped back into the dynamic, chaotic source of state zero. It was a brutal, highly effective form of shadow integration. Finally, let's talk about walking with a defined shadow. So how do we achieve this state of true self-governance in our modern lives without putting on the iron cap? Well, it requires a deliberate, internal, cognitive act called metanoia, which translates simply to change your mind. And to be clear, this isn't superficial positive thinking. This is mental alchemy. It means striking light directly into your darkest shadow, re-scripting your limiting beliefs, and actively converting the heavy burden of P3 into raw rotational energy. You are transmuting your internal resistance into the very fuel that spins your gyroscope. But to maintain this dynamic balance, you absolutely need a center of gravity. For a disk to spin without just flying off into chaos, it must rotate around a central mast anchored by gravity. Gravity is the ultimate sovereign regulator here. It provides the necessary structural pressure to keep our newly awakened energy focused and bound. Simply put, you need a core pillar of disciplined intent. When you finally achieve this balance, you step out of the diminished state and into the sovereign self. This is the exact moment where your internal capacity is finally greater than the sum of the three pressures bearing down on you. You completely abandon the fragile trap of static peace, and instead you live in a state of active readiness. You become anti-fragile. The motion itself becomes your stability. And this brings us to the secret mathematical formula of this entire philosophy. 1 + 1 = 3. By consciously synthesizing your conscious light, the 1, with your dark, chaotic shadow, the 0, you don't just cancel them out. No, you create an entirely new emergent state of wholeness that is exponentially greater than the sum of its parts. That 3 right there, that is the sovereign self. As you explore this explainer and the source archives further, I want to leave you with this final mechanical reality. A properly balanced gyroscope doesn't fall over when you push it. The external force actually causes it to precess, to move at right angles and maintain its integrity. You are built for this exact kind of precession. So rather than bracing against the chaos, how will you harness the external winds of life to spin your core even faster? Stop bracing against the wind, start spinning.